Okay, so in this little video, we're going to look at the general structure of tubular organs. Now, remember, I asked you to identify a layer. First thing that should come into your mind is a tunic. So our innermost layer is the Tunica Mucosa. In general, a mucous membrane is the lining epithelium of tubular organ and its underlying connective tissue. Okay. Then we have a connective tissue layer under that, which is the Tunica Submucosa. Okay, then we have a muscular layer, the Tunica Muscularis. And then our outermost layer when we are in a body cavity is going to be the Tunica Serosa. Okay, this Tunica Serosa is going to be continuous with a mesentery that suspends the organ. So we have Visceral Peritoneum is the Tunica Serosa, and then it becomes continuous through the mesentery with a parietal peritoneum. Okay, we'll show you that in a little bit. So our Tunica Mucosa is going to consist of three structures. Okay, we're going to have the epithelium, the underlying connective tissue is known as the lamina propria. Within this section here, I got to point out a very nice lacteal. And then what we cannot see on this image, but I'll show you on subsequent images, is the Muscularis Mucosa. Okay, so those three structures make up our Tunica Mucosa. Okay? Now we look at this image here. We see the epithelium. The connective tissue underneath the epithelium is the lamina propria. And then down here we see the Muscularis Mucosa. Now let's take a close-up look down there. See the epithelium, lamina propria, Muscularis Mucosa. Now that would be this if I asked you to identify the structure. If I asked you to identify the tissue, the epithelium would be simple columnar microvillus epithelium. For the lamina propria, the tissue would be loose connective tissue, that's right. And for the Muscularis Mucosa, remember the Muscularis Mucosa is going to always be smooth muscle. Okay? We may have 2 or up to 4 layers of Muscularis Mucosa. An important purpose for the Muscularis Mucosa is that the contraction of it puts the epithelium closer to the contents in the lumen. And also we find that going up into villi, we have smooth muscle from the Muscularis Mucosa that upon contraction is going to shorten the villi and help pump lymph and blood from the villi as we are having digestion and absorption occur. Sometimes we have glandular structures that extend from the epithelium down into the lamina propria. These are referred to as Mucosal Glands. So here once again Tunica Mucosa, and the connective tissue layer underneath is the Tunica Submucosa. As you see here, the Tunica Submucosa has numerous vessels. Okay, also make note that even though the collagen fibers are more dense, because the collagen fibers aren't as dense as what we generally see for dense irregular, and it is more cellular, there's more amorphous substance, this is still considered loose connective tissue. Okay? So the Tunica Submucosa consists of loose connective tissue. We see a lot of vessels here, we see a lot of nerves here. We even see submucosal ganglion plexes. Okay, so these are going to be parasympathetic ganglia, because recall that the parasympathetic ganglia are at or within the organ of target. Okay? Sometimes we have the epithelium extend down into the Tunica Submucosa and create glands there. These are referred to as submucosal glands. It's also in this region that we may see lymphatic nodules as lymphatic tissue. Okay, so we may see individual lymphatic nodules, or we may see tonsils or Peyer's patches, depending on where we're at. Okay. Now sometimes, as we see in this case here, we see the epithelium, then we see a connective tissue layer, and then we see the Tunica Muscularis. Okay, so we don't see a Muscularis mucosa here. In a case where we do not have a Muscularis mucosa, we just combine the lamina propria and the submucosa and call that structure the lamina propria submucosa. If I asked you to identify this layer, then you'd tell me that is the Tunica Mucosa submucosa. Okay? So let's go back to this image. We have a Tunica submucosa here. We have a Tunica Muscularis. Okay, now don't be calling the muscle layer in vessels the Tunica Muscularis. Remember, that's the tunica media. So in the Tunica Muscularis, we have an inner circular and outer longitudinal. Okay? But in most of our tubular organs, it's going to be smooth muscle. Remember, it's going to be involuntary muscle. Okay? Got it. Okay, we're going to find that in some of our tubular organs. Our Tunica Muscularis consists of an inner longitudinal, a middle circular, and an outer longitudinal. This is primarily in the urinary tract. Okay? So sometimes we see that between the two muscle layers we have ganglion nerve plexes once again. Okay, so this myenteric ganglion plexus, myenteric referring to muscle layer. Okay, that's also going to be a parasympathetic ganglia. Remember, smooth muscle is similar to cardiac muscle in that it can generate its own action potential for peristalsis. Okay, so these layers are important for peristalsis. However, in some cases, we do have skeletal muscle. So here in the esophagus, we see that Tunica Muscularis is skeletal muscle in most animals in just the proximal esophagus. Some animals, such as the canine and the bovine, it's going to be skeletal throughout the length of the esophagus. So why is that? In the canine, out in the wild, we see them going out and hunting, eating up their kill. Then they come back and they regurgitate some of that food to feed their young. Okay, so they need to have the ability to purposely regurgitate that food to feed their young. Okay, and in the bovine, or in other herbivores that have a rumen, they need to regurgitate that food up and re-chew their cud, so to speak. Okay, so they bring it back up a second time to chew it further and then swallow it back down. Okay? So our outermost layer is going to be the Tunica Serosa. So we have this outer layer here, which consists of a connective tissue as well as a mesothelium. So this is going to be our Tunica Serosa. Remember that in the abdominal cavity, that Tunica Serosa is going to be the same as the Visceral Peritoneum. Okay? And then that Visceral Peritoneum is going to be continuous through the mesentery with the parietal peritoneum. Okay? So let's look at all these layers again. So epithelium and the lamina propria Muscularis Mucosa, making up the Tunica Mucosa. The submucosa, the Tunica Muscularis, generally consisting of inner circular, outer longitudinal. Okay, so the Tunica Muscularis, remember, is important for peristalsis. So peristalsis is the segmental contraction and relaxation of the smooth muscle. Okay, and so it helps propel food down the digestive tract. And remember, it's controlled by the autonomic nervous system, so we can increase or decrease peristalsis. Okay, and then we have the Tunica Serosa. Now, if we are not within the abdominal cavity or any other body cavity, it's going to be lined by a Tunica Fibrosa. Okay. So as we said, the visceral peritoneum is suspended by a mesentery. Okay. And now we're going to name these mesenteries. Okay. So if it's the mesentery that is suspending the duodenum, it's going to be the mesoduodenum. Okay. If it's suspending the colon, it's going to be the mesocolon. And so forth and so on. Okay, let's look at this illustration here. So within this line right here is the abdominal cavity. So all the organs are present within the abdominal cavity. Now if we put our peritoneum on here, okay, so there's our parietal peritoneum, and then we see that the kidneys are beneath that parietal peritoneum, so we call those retroperitoneal. And then here we have our mesenteries going out to our organs. So suspending the colon is the mesocolon. Suspending the duodenum is the mesoduodenum. We see that there is a pancreas within the mesoduodenum. And then around each of the organs is the visceral peritoneum. So see how that peritoneum is continuous with each other. So now within this line is the peritoneal cavity. And just like in the pleural cavity, there's just a little bit of fluid. That's the same thing within the peritoneal cavity. And similar to a mucous membrane, a serous membrane is a mesothelium lining a body cavity and its underlying connective tissue. Okay?